Hello, everybody. This is week 6, and we're going to talk about effective communication. I mentioned in a previous lecture that communication breakdowns or lack of communication is really the number one thing that I see when I consult or work with other organizations. This is the thing that really halts all of their ability to work together, be efficient, be motivated, and achieve higher results. So communication is key. And oftentimes people think it's easy. We're just going to talk to one another. It is much more complex than that. And it is, it sometimes can be very difficult for even the most, even those organizations who do very well in their culture and think they're very good at communicating. It can also be a challenge for them as well. Okay, here, let's see. Let's hop to it. All right. What are the 3 functions of communication? 1, we want to transmit information, right? We want to get that information out there. We want to coordinate effort. We're telling people information, hopefully not to hear ourselves speak, but in a business setting, hopefully it's because we're trying to get to our end result. And then, in a general day-to-day, we share our emotions and feelings with one another. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm upset, I'm mad. How do I feel about this? That is the 3 functions of communication: to transmit, to coordinate, and to share your emotions. So there's this process model of communication, and I will let you look at this a little more closely because it does tend to make a bit more sense if you have a chance to look at it and digest it. But let's just suffice to say we've got this sender, and they are the person who is originating the message. And then we have the receiver, who is the person who receives the message. And the receiver will have to decode this message by assigning meaning. And this is where often, if we're in person in this class, we'll do the game of gossip, and we'll show the difference and how things can be decoded from the sender to the receiver all the way through. It's that game that you used to play as a kid. Okay, what about this idea of synchronicity? Before COVID, most people wouldn't have any idea what synchronous and asynchronous type of communication is, but now, of course, we really do. Synchronous communication is where we have the ability to have a conversation with a clear beginning or ending. When we do our Zoom meetings, for example, that is synchronous communication. That's a personal meeting, live chat, a Zoom, a phone conversation. There's a beginning and end. It's very personalized. That's synchronous. When you come into a VCM class or you come into a classroom in person, that is a synchronous class setting. They create more positive relationships with these synchronous types of environments, for sure. It helps people perform better at work and concentrate more at tasks it can. So even though people say they prefer to be asynchronous, they actually are more efficient, and there's better collaboration, better communication, sharing of emotions, etc., if there is a larger percentage of synchronous type of communication. So those of you who have groaned and said, oh, I can't believe she made us meet in Teams on Zoom, it's because synchronous communication is so important. Tone, eye contact, body language, all of these sort of things that plays into a synchronous communication environment. Okay, what are some of these organizational problems that we encounter? Reliance on technology, dominance of email, less face-to-face communication. All of these sort of asynchronous types of things create these sort of organizational issues because we're not having these conversations, and we would rather often send 14 texts than pick up the phone and resolve an issue very quickly. Or we would rather send a multitude of emails where we can't determine tone. We've kind of inferred what a person might be saying and how they might be saying it in our own head. And that can lead to a lot of conflict, right? I always tell people that work for me, if you have to send more than 2, at max 3, depending on the subject email, you should have picked up the phone. That is a maximum amount of emails that should be sent on a single subject before the phone gets picked up or a meeting is arranged. Okay, what's the problem with electronic communication? Well, we know there's too much information and it's too low quality. We so want to determine what the tone sounds like. A lot of times we overwrite something. I'm guilty of this. I'm hugely guilty of this. I want to make sure that I try to convey tone as much as possible. And sometimes that adds to the word count, for sure. There's no content to information. It lacks meaning oftentimes. And, the interpretation, really depends on the relationship with the sender. If you're already frustrated and upset with an individual, or you don't care for that individual, then you're going to take everything in a more negative context than it might have been intended. And I've seen that with students when, they have asked for something, they've turned something in, or they've gotten, feedback they didn't do well on an assignment. They're already upset. So when they ask me for it, maybe the tone is, I assume the tone is already negative, or maybe they're assuming that my response back is negative. It's quite an interesting sort of dynamic. Okay, coaching and counseling. What are the differences here? Coaching, we want to give advice and direction, right? We want to improve people, but we want to do it in a real friendly one-on-one kind of capacity to help them. Our criticisms are truly constructive. Counseling focuses on attitudes, how, helping someone resolve somebody by how they're approaching it and how they're feeling about it. So that's coaching and counseling. So let's think about, when do we coach and when do we counsel? We coach when there's a lack of ability. We want to train someone up. When there's insufficient information and we can provide that support. When they're incompetent, when they're not able to take on a task because they simply do not know how. And when somebody must understand the problem, they lack the capacity or lack the understanding of the problem and why it must be resolved. Those are coaching scenarios. What about counseling? Personality clashes, right? Mediation, that's a counseling type of thing. When someone's defensive, someone can't accept that criticism. This is an area where counseling takes place. Supportive communication. This is based on, when we think about the idea, the concept of congruence, a match between what someone thinks and what someone feels. Not always easy to do, particularly in electronic communications. That is why I say you must pick up the phone. You must give that person, that receiver, the opportunity to have congruence, so they can match what you mean and what you, with how they should be feeling. So that is an important type of distinction here on how that can be more supportive. Okay. Supportive communication is also descriptive. It focuses on behavior. It focuses on solutions. It is problem-oriented, right? It doesn't focus on these personal traits. It doesn't focus on you doing something wrong. It focuses on the need to solve a problem and how we get to that together. So it focuses on the strength of the individual versus the weakness of the individual in order to generate a solution. It validates others. It makes them feel good. It's flexible and two-way. It's back and forth. It's what we consider to be transparency. There's agreement at the end of it. Supportive communication is also specific. A lot of times, vague communication leads to a lot of problems. I once told some folks, I managed this young man, and he was a graphic designer, and he kept coming in late. And I said, hey, you keep coming in late, but we have a team of people, and not all of them are like yourself and salaried employees. So, he was a salaried employee, meaning that he was, he had a set salary, regardless of how many hours he put in. And we had hourly employees that got paid by the number of hours they were there. And I said, it's creating a rift because they're here from 8 to 5 and they're getting paid for 8 to 5, but you're coming in from 9 to 5 and also getting paid 8 to 5. And it's creating some, some resentment here. But the way that I did it, I said, hey, I just want you to know you're an amazing designer. You're one of the best I've ever worked with. Your work is so good. You are fantastic. I said, you need to start coming in on time because it's creating resentment in the team. But, you are wonderful. And, and it probably wasn't that extreme, but that's what he heard. So when he walked away, he heard, I'm awesome. I don't need to change a thing. Well, a couple of weeks later, he continued to be late. And I said, hey, I've spoken with you about this. Why are you still coming in late? I mean, now I'm upset because I'm feeling like he's not listening to me, and he's bewildered because he never heard it to begin with. So it has to be specific enough. And in person, I often teach people how to fire people because that specificity is one of the most difficult things to achieve sometimes when you are terminating an employee. You terminate an employee, you need to do so within the first sentence. You need to say, Sam, I'm sorry that we're going to need to let you go. And then you can give a couple of reasons, but a termination should be quick. It should be efficient. But a lot of times people will say, Sam, we wanted to bring you in. You've been a valued employee for the last 5 years. And, there are some things that we really need to discuss. What that does is that's given Sam some confusing information. Sam doesn't know if he's getting written up. He doesn't know if he's getting a promotion, a bonus, a raise. He doesn't know if what is happening here. And until you say that an individual has been let go or terminated, it's negotiable. At any point, Stan realizes what's about to happen. He can jump in and start begging or start making amends or start doing something else. It's immediate. Once you've decided to terminate somebody, no amount of them begging or apologizing or anything else should change your mind. The resentment will always be there, and there's a distinct lack of trust because you've already made the determination they no longer work there. So it has to be specific, and that is a good example of that. Okay, supportive communication also needs to be conjunctive. It needs to be joined to something else, right? It just can't be floating out here in space and just random. A lot of times, that was random. That's because it lacks this idea of conjunctiveness. Okay, disjunctive communication. What does that mean? There's extended topics. Extended pauses. There's topic controls. There's like quick, abrupt shifts and pivots in the conversation that confuses people. There's lack of opportunity to let others speak or have a say in anything. That's very disjunctive communication. Supportive communication, it acknowledges the source of the idea. I'm going to acknowledge, hey, Jessica, that was a fantastic idea. It gives ownership and it gives people the ability to want to convey their ideas when they know that they're going to be, have the ability to have that owned. And it's someone else is not going to take credit for it. What about disowned communication? What do we think about that? The listener just never knows whose point of view. They just never know where it's coming. And we've all been like, okay, now, are you saying that or is she saying that? Are you saying that or is he saying that? Where is this coming from? That is an example of disowned communication. And we've all been in those sorts of conversations. Okay, supportive communication also requires very active listening. Somebody asked me not too long ago, actually, they said, so do you give this person advice on their siblings helping them out with their parents? And a friend of mine, and I said, I do not. I said, I do not have siblings. I lack that context. And here's the thing. This is exactly what I said. I said, most people would prefer you listen anyway. Most people don't really want advice. Most of them want you to listen. So sometimes you need to qualify it and with an individual, do you really want my advice or do you really want me to listen to agree with the path that you've already chosen? And it's okay to say that to your friends and family rather than walk down a path where they don't want, and it just becomes a little bit conflicted at that point because they didn't really want that advice to begin with. Okay, what are some communication barriers? Well, language problems certainly is a communication barrier. Too much information. I just don't know what to process. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. Sometimes students feel that way in classes. There's just too much. How do I break it down? You can't eat an elephant all at once. You got to chunk it down. So think about it that way. How to filter it, right? How did I filter it down? How did I interpret it? So those are some of the communication barriers. What about miscommunication? I think this is a very, very interesting thing. And this was back in 1990 and 1991. 50 to 90% of a manager's time is spent communicating. And that is tied to a manager's performance. My guess is that is really still just as high, if not higher. So that's certainly very interesting. I also think that this NASA experiment NASA study is very interesting because they said that deficient interpersonal communication was a causal factor in 70 to 80% of aviation accidents. That is amazing. That is almost scary when you think about that is the fine line between an aviation accident and being safe. Okay. What about other barriers to effective communication? Selective perception. I don't want to hear it, therefore I hear something else. That's kind of the situation with the graphic designer, right? He didn't want to hear anything negative, so all he heard was the positive. I contributed to that certainly, but that's part of selective perception. Gender differences. Genders, communicate very differently. Body language. The differences in sender receiver. Some of that can be cultural. It can be language. Bias language. We learn a little bit about bias language in marketing research. How do we set up, if you're asking someone, a question on a market research survey, it shouldn't be like, how wonderful do you think our products are? That's a very sort of biased situation, but people tend to do that in business communication as well. Filtering is the kind of this idea of withholding information, right? We tend to be like, I'm going to scoot around it. I'm not going to tell you quite everything. I'm going to just give you the bits and parts that help manage this, or don't shoot the messenger. We say that as well. You just pass along enough bits of information that you say, well, I told them, but in fact, you withheld a good amount of information. A lot of people would call this a lie by omission. I guess it depends on how much you filtered out, whether or not it was a lie or just simply that you left out some pertinent facts. Okay, what are some other barriers to communication? This is a selective perception, as we talked about before. This is the filtering what we see in here to suit our own needs. I want to hear it or I don't want to hear it. This happens a lot. We think about selective perception in advertising. If I'm in the market for a new car, I'm suddenly seeing car ads everywhere. If I'm hungry, I'm seeing food ads everywhere. This is a kind of a real basic way that selective perception works. People will hear things if they agree with what they would want to hear and see at that moment. Okay, information overload. This is so key in the world that we live in now. There's so much noise. There's so much information all over the place. Information overload really is a barrier. How do I create succinct and salient points in a condensed format? I tell you guys all the time, I'm not impressed. I told the team this. I'm not impressed if you give me a 100-page paper. I would rather, that probably means you've been redundant. You've given too much information. I would rather it be fantastic and be 30 pages and then me know that every bit of information in there is warranted, valid, and it's needed. So think about how you can do that. Business communication often just gets too much information and it gets redundant. And what happens 99% of the time with redundancies is there's contradictions. And that contributes to this very difficult barrier for effective communication with there's contradictions in the information that has been provided. Okay. Information overload. There are a couple of different things that we can think of. The job's information load exceeds the person's information processing. It's just too much. Then we will have information that's been overlooked. They just couldn't capture it all. There's two sets of solutions. You can increase your processing. You can become educated. You can learn more skills, become more experienced, or you can increase, reduce the information load. So there's a couple of opportunities to do that as well. Okay, emotional disconnects. This happens when someone is upset or mad. I always say when someone is upset or mad, take a few minutes. One of the things that we do in our very, very reactive culture is we respond right then. We don't need to do that. You can always, unless it's a life or death situation, even then you can take 30 seconds. Always take 5 minutes, take an hour, take a day, take whatever you need. These are important to keep in mind, that if somebody's coming at you, you can say, I want to give this the importance that I think this conversation needs. I'm not at a place where I can talk about it right this second, but I want to be able to come back to you. Can you give me just a little bit of time so that we can sit down and talk through this? That oftentimes gives them an opportunity to simmer down a little bit, and it gives you the opportunity to kind of formulate a game plan. Have you ever been upset and you become tongue-tied and because you're trying to, jump in there and do it? This gives you the opportunity to just form your thoughts. And oftentimes you will see where they're coming from as well. So when you start the conversation, you say, I see where you're coming from, but I want to explain where I'm coming from so that we can kind of find some middle ground and I can, make some decisions and, we can come to a good solution here. Okay. Lack of source credibility. I mean, we live in a world where information is coming all over the place and we don't know who to trust. A lot of times we don't even know if we trust our news because every channel may be reporting the same information very differently with a very different spin. So information credibility is something that we grapple with every single day. We grapple with source credibility in things like Wikipedia. How often have all of us went to a Wikipedia to get information? There's no telling if it's true. We get information off of social media. All of this stuff that's coming in, and we have no way of knowing how credible or reliable the information is before we pass it on to another individual. Okay, grapevine. Grapevine is one of those things that we talked about earlier in this lecture about gossip. This powerful tool for disseminating information, but a lot of times it can take a real negative turn. We live in a society, unfortunately, where people are more apt to become negative in our cancel culture than they are to pick up something and spread positivity. So always keep that in mind, that something can turn very negative and there can be this cancel culture effect very, very quickly. And that is what Grapevine can't has the tendency to do. Often you're not spreading the most positive, wonderful news ever. You're spreading something that becomes more and more negative as it goes along. Okay, semantics. Semantics, that's the meaning of communication. Words can mean different things to different people, right? So this is something where different businesses have different jargon. In every business I've been in, I've had to find out exactly how they did their pricing models, because I've worked with places they focused on profit margins. I've worked on places where they focused on cost margins. I've worked on places where they did it based on per week or per day or per month, or their fiscal year was different. Everybody has different jargon. So if you understand in your business education how something functionally works, then you're able to kind of say, what do you mean by that, and then apply that knowledge based on their jargon. That's incredibly important. Okay, jargon, that's what we were just talking about, this shorthand among experts. Every profession and organization has it. Sometimes you just have to, get a little bit of experience, and don't be afraid to ask, what do you mean by this? All right. What about gender differences in communications? Men and women, they work together every day. Men often speak in sports metaphors, and women use their home. They tend to be more emotional. Let's look at some of the ways that men and women are different. Okay. So men view conversations as more power status, right? They report talk, they give advice quickly, they dominate the conversation. This isn't all of them, certainly. Don't be like, that's not true for me. It's just a generalization. Women are approach things with more interpersonal, more rapport. They're more sensitive to nonverbal cues. They're more emotional in terms of reading people and, are you okay? What's going on? They may be more likely to give you indirect advice or requests. Okay. Cross-cultural communication. This can be a huge thing. We have whole, part of the weekend classes and things like that. We talk a lot about this cross-cultural communication. Language problems. My first job was for a Japanese copier and fax manufacturer. And the very first day I got there, I met one of the Japanese leaders, and he said, hi. And I said, hi. And said something and said, hi. And I said, hi back. And it went on for a little bit until my boss was rolling almost in tears, because he was saying yes, and I kept saying yes back to him. And I kept going back and forth with yes, 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 yes. That's what hi was. I thought he was telling me hello. Language and voice intonation, of course. As I've said in another lecture, voice intonation is a very big deal. People will consider Americans to be arrogant because we tend to speak with more confidence, more rapidly, a little louder, and that's off-putting to them, and they consider that arrogant. So that's sort of interesting. The way that we do our body language and nonverbal, very different in a lot of countries. Cultures. I've worked for a number of international companies and traveled internationally, and that is very interesting. And most of them will give you that rundown if there's significant cultural differences, but sometimes you just have to figure it out or do the homework before you go. What about biased language? Well, biased language, this is the type of language that can offend others. And oftentimes, people don't even realize that this is a part of their value system, how they're brought up, and that it is something that could be offensive. It is really remarkable how oftentimes this will get somebody tied up. And then, of course, cancel culture kicks in and they're done. They didn't even have the opportunity to be educated on why that was, poor communication or a poor choice of words before they were canceled. And that is the environment we live in. So you have to go in and try to be very, careful with what you're using, and particularly if you're using idioms or you're using slang or things that could be construed as being culturally insensitive. All right. Poor listening versus active listening. All right. I'm trying to see how many more we've got in this one. I wonder if I have stopped there. What I'm going to do? I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to do another lecture where we talk about some of these listening skills. I think that'll be good, and that gives you a break, and it also gives me one as well. I think I've doubled up on lectures here. So I will let this one be the one, and I will see you in the next video.